Everybody, welcome to this session on debatable debates in glaucoma. We are going to have 7 debates by our esteemed speakers. Each talk will be of 4 minutes, followed by 3 minutes of discussion by the discussant, and then we take one take-home message by our panelists. So without wasting much of time, the first topic for the debate is disc hemorrhage in normal tension glaucoma. We have escalate treatment immediately versus close monitoring. We have 2 speakers. Escalate treatment immediately is Dr. Randir Kumar and close monitoring is by Dr. Shefali Parikh. And the discussion for this is Dr. Aditya Agarwal. So we start our first speaker with Dr. Randir Kumar. Dr. Randir, over to you. Please share your screen.
Thank you, Dr. Amit. Should I share?
Yeah, start sharing your screen, please.
Yeah, sure. Are my slides visible?
Slides are visible and you are audible.
Okay, thank you, Amit. At the outset, I am thankful to the organizers for having me here. Well, I have been given the topic of disc hemorrhage in LTG. Should we escalate or not? And the answer is yes, and yes. I have no financial interest. A word about glaucoma and optic disc hemorrhage. The association of optic disc hemorrhage with glaucoma was first recognized more than 100 years ago by Zdeněk P. Zeram, who called it as a glaucoma hemorrhagicum. Today, the optic disc hemorrhage is known to have a strong association with glaucoma development and progression. However, its low prevalence and transient nature render elucidation of its exact pathogenesis and causal relationship with the glaucoma prognosis difficult. Now I come to our specific topic in NTG and optic disc hemorrhage. Well, a normal tension glaucoma can be difficult to diagnose in the absence of an elevated IOP. But there is a damage to the optic nerve. We all know it. Research have shown that disc hemorrhage is a notable risk factor for disease progression, and its presence may indicate a need for a more intense treatment. The researchers have even shown and documented the appearance of the new glaucomatous visual field defect that are faster and more visible once you have an optic disc hemorrhage. Therefore, it is a well-established warning sign. And it is something like this lion with a bloody face. And even after seeing this, this lion, if my worthy opponent want to wait, then the God only can save her. So I'll come out with some of the studies which are basically supporting the evidence that you should always escalate a treatment once you find an optic disc hemorrhage. There's a study in which a patient with the pre-perimetric glaucoma shows that the ODH was associated with glaucoma progression, specifically with a structural change. These results suggest that the glaucoma patient who experience episode of optic disc hemorrhage are at a higher likelihood for the faster RNFL thinning. A little bit of pathophysiology as to how is this disc hemorrhage corroborate with the progression of the glaucoma. Many studies have concluded that optic disc hemorrhage is a consequence of microvascular disruption resulting from structural alteration in the lamina cribrosa. A recent prospective studies have shown that the glaucomatous eyes with the optic disc hemorrhage at a site of a focal lamina cribrosa defect had a frequent and faster visual field progression than the eyes with the optic disc hemorrhage unaccompanied by the LC alterations. Considering that the LC is a primary site of the glaucomatous damage, optic disc hemorrhage can provide secondary clue to the identification of vulnerable lamina cribrosa and thus of a patient who are at a very high risk of further progression. There are many studies in glaucoma with optic disc hemorrhage which had shown that a greater IOP reduction in combination with a more aggressive treatment after optic disc hemorrhage contributed to the slower rate of progression of visual field. These findings may imply that a glaucomatous eyes with the optic disc hemorrhage treatment needs treatment intensification. And even if the optic disc hemorrhage is not a cause of glaucoma progression, it might still be an important sign of need for the treatment intensification. Therefore, I will say that yes, even with seeing a disc hemorrhage, you should escalate your treatment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Randir. Over to you, Dr. Shefali Parikh. Randir, please stop sharing your screen.
Yeah, he has to stop sharing, yes.
Yeah, Dr. Shefali, to you.
Yeah. So visible?
Yeah, visible and
Good morning,
audible. Please
everybody.
reset the timer.
Yeah. Thank you, Amit and AIOS, for giving me this opportunity. So I'm going to talk on disc hemorrhage in normal tension glaucoma, this debate. What would be my next step? Now, definitely it will
4
be.
minutes. Excuse me, Shefali. 4 minutes for the timer.
Okay, I have to put the timer? No.
No, they have put 3 minutes. Hall in charge, please make the timer 4 minutes.
Yeah, okay. So definitely, if I see the disc hemorrhage, I would follow it very closely, and my management would be the close monitoring. Now, yes, we have enough evidence, like my colleague said, that the disc hemorrhage is indicative of progression. In fact, if you see the EMGT study, which is one of the largest study to study the natural history of the disease, it has shown that disc hemorrhage is one of the risk factor for long-term progression. Even collaborative normal tension glaucoma study have shown disc hemorrhage as the risk factor for progression of the visual field. But the question here is, if you see the disc field, is it time to escalate the treatment? Then definitely my answer is no. Now I'll tell you the logic behind it. Now we go back to the EMGT study. Now EMGT study, it has published, if you see the results, that in the treatment group, the prevalence of the disc hemorrhage was more, around 50% compared to the 45% in the control group. So if there was any effect of treatment or the intraocular pressure reduction, then definitely this prevalence of the disc hemorrhage would have been less in the treated group compared to the control group, but it is not like that. They also published that the frequency of disc hemorrhage did not differ between the treated and the control group over a period of long-term follow-up. It was nearly same. And also that intraocular pressure reducing treatment was unrelated to the presence or frequency of disc hemorrhage. In fact, they concluded that the disc hemorrhage cannot be considered an indication of insufficient IOP lowering treatment, and also that glaucoma progression in eyes with disc hemorrhage cannot be totally halted by intraocular pressure reduction. So basically, we have to look for the different pathophysiological mechanism. Like the low pressure glaucoma treatment study have shown that there are other mechanisms like migraine, insufficient autoregulation with leading to the varying degree of ischemia of the optic nerve, low systolic BP, nocturnal arterial hypotension, which are the risk factors for the disc hemorrhage. If you see the study by Sung, they have published that the patient who progressed had high IOP fluctuation or high fluctuation in the diurnal diastolic pressure. So is it possible that high fluctuation in BP is precursor of both disc hemorrhage and glaucoma progression rather than only the disc hemorrhage leading to glaucoma progression? So to conclude, so it is important that we diagnose the underlying pathology or the risk factor, because this undiagnosed underlying pathology or the risk factor would continue to cause the disc hemorrhage and disease worsening. So the diagnosing this pathology and taking care of this is of paramount importance, and we must modify this risk factor rather than only treating the intraocular pressure. So if I have to reiterate, after seeing this disc hemorrhage and I know it is associated with the progression, then also do we need to intensify treatment? Definitely no. But rather than that, I will advise to intensify our observation. We have to be more careful, more vigilant, and we have to do frequent follow-up visit so that the progression can be identified early, and we have to see if there is associated systemic factor that we need to work out. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shefali, for concluding before time. So we have Dr. Aditya Agrawal as a discussion for this particular debate. Over to you, Dr. Aditya. Timer of 3 minutes, please. Reset the timer to 3 minutes.
Yes, we are doing it. You please continue. We are doing it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Scientific Committee and Amit, for having me here. Am I audible?
You're audible, sir.
I would like to congratulate both the speakers for putting up their point very comprehensively. We have two theories for the pathophysiology of appearance of this hemorrhage. The first is mechanical, which shows that there is some neurodegenerative insult. There is remodeling of the lamina capriosa, and there is a glial scar formation which leads to traction on the blood vessels, leading to the disc hemorrhage. There is also vascular theory which shows that there is a ischemic microinfarction and alteration in the blood retinal barrier. And recent OCT studies of the OCT angio studies show that there is a decrease in the peripapillary choroidal vasculation after during the appearance of the disc hemorrhage. So both these theories do point that there is some neuronal tissue insult going on there. But as rightly pointed out by Shefali, that the disc hemorrhage also occur in diabetes mellitus, BRVO, PVD, patients on antiplatelet therapy, and in ischemic optic neuropathy. We see that the disc hemorrhage is commonly at the inferior and the superior rim, which is also the site for glaucoma. And there is evidence that following after 2 to 3 months of the appearance of the disc hemorrhage, there is notching and visual field loss and progression of the disease. There are systemic associations and ocular association both for disc hemorrhages as well as for these associations are also the risk factors for glaucoma. And Shefali has very pointed out the limitation of the collaborative normal intensive glaucoma study and the EMJT study. What we need to see is that there is a chance of halting the progression of the disease if we further reduce the intraocular pressure. The question we need to ask ourselves is how low is low enough? And we all know that the goal of glaucoma therapy is we have to preserve the quality of vision without affecting the quality of life of the patient at an affordable cost. So as rightly pointed out by Shefali, one has to customize and tailor-make the treatment and individualize it to the patient's need and the requirement. We have to take into account the severity of the disease, the rate of progression, level of the damaging IOP, current therapy, age of the patient, status of comorbidity, and the systemic therapy which we are taking. We have also to take into account the risk of escalating the treatment. And in patients whom we need to follow up, we have to take the family and the patient as an informed partner for doing that. We have to emphasize the necessity of a very close monitoring and follow-up visits. And we have to explain to the patient that the risk of not treating also comes with the risk of more damage, which is irreversible. Another point which I would like to mention is that we have to make sure the adherence and the compliance of the patient before escalating the treatment. We have to make sure that the patient is taking proper treatment or not. So my take home is
thank you, Dr. Abhinay Agarwal. Thank you.
Individualize
just finish here
and make it tailor-made for the patient and only then proceed. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So for this debate, we take a concluding remark by our panelists, our esteemed panelist, Dr. Deven Tully. Can you just give a quick concluding remark for the audience?
Yeah, so I think for the audience, we can just say that if you can rule out the other causes for disc hemorrhage in that particular patient, and in that regard, you have no other option, but sometimes you have to escalate the treatment, but keep the differentials in mind, and also take it as a risk factor. If you think that the patient cannot follow up, it's okay to err on the side of over-treatment. Thank you, Amit.
Thank you, Dr. Deven, for such a short and sweet remark. Before we go ahead with this program, as a customary, I would like to welcome all our esteemed panelists for this session on debatable debates in glaucoma. We have our panelists as Dr. J.C. Das, Dr. Madhu Bhaduria, Dr. N.R. Rangaraj, Dr. R. Ventesh, Dr. Partha Mandal, Dr. Jatinder Singh Bhalla, and Dr. Deven Tully. So without wasting much time, I go to the second topic of the debate, that is tonometry in general OPD, applanation for all versus eye care for all. So we have Dr. Shweta Tripathi. Please start sharing your screen. We are going to speak for applanation for all, and against it, we have eye care for all by Dr. Mrunali Dhavalikar. And the discussion for this is Dr. Manju Pillai.
Can I start, Dr. Amit?
Yeah, please start, Dr. Shweta.
My slides are visible?
You are audible and visible both. Please start the timer exactly for 4 minutes.
Okay. Thank you so much. So my topic for today's debate is tonometry in general OPD, applanation for all. Before that, I would like to thank Dr. Amit Purwal and the entire scientific committee for giving me this opportunity. So we all know that the importance of precise IOP measurement is well-known fact whenever it comes to diagnose a case of glaucoma. starting the therapy or modulating the therapy as well when the cases are progressing. And the concept of baseline IOP was conceptualized keeping in mind that we all know that's a time-tested phrase in glaucoma which fits to all the cases is each and every millimeter of mercury pressure counts, especially when we talk about the normal tension glaucoma or the ocular hypertensive patients. Let me simplify it for you. So looking at these clinical pictures where the top picture shows a healthy optic nerve hit and the bottom picture shows kind of early notch which can be missed off in a busy general OPD. So the question arises that can we send off these patients home depending upon a single reading taken by RT? The answer might be yes or might be no. So let's have a look further ahead again. When we look at the pictures along with the detailed findings and the detailed examination, clinical examination, we see that none of these patients can be sent home on a single finding of RT. So now the decision changes clearly from yes to no. Let's see that what the literature has to say, which says that agreement, because whenever any new instrument is launched or it's there is a validation which is required, and also that there is an agreement which needs to be done before with the pre-existing instrument. So the agreement is higher in the range between RT and GAT is higher in the range of 9 to 22 millimeters of mercury. That's a normal range. But in glaucoma, we cannot assume that all the patients are going to be normal who are coming to the general OPD. Also, it says that the discrepancies are there in whenever the pressure is crossing 22 millimeters of mercury. And this is the tonometer, the RT is the tonometer, which is going to be more affected by the pachymetry. And it's not possible to do a pachymetry in a general OPD, which is so busy, where we are talking to go for only RTs to save the time. Also, when we talk about the pachymetry, we know that the lower corneas are, or we can say the lower pachymetry readings are the risk factors according to the OHTS for progression. So again, it says that in the thin corneas, the agreement is not there with the GAT. So now this is a very important point that the ISO standardization, that is 8612, it says that as long as the Goldman tonometer is applicable, it should be used first of all for all reproducible IOP readings. Though the merits of RT being less cumbersome, especially useful in children and uncooperative patients, cannot be denied, but it can be used as a tool of mass screening in camps. But when a patient comes to a super specialty center, the accountability definitely increases, which makes GAT the gold standard, which can never be replaced by any other alternative when it comes to measure the only modifiable risk factor of permanent blinding conditions, that's IOP. So to summarize, I assert that applanation tonometry should be done for all the cases in general OPD, though the learning curve is definitely there. But as well said, that to become an expert from a novice, the case continuous practice and feedback, so the learning curve can be overcome by it. Thank you all.
Over to you, Dr. Murali.
Yes, sir.
Shweta, stop sharing your screen, please.
Stop
Yeah.
sharing,
I have stopped.
Yeah, fine. Thank you.
Thank you.
yeah. Is it visible, sir?
It's visible and audible. Please go ahead.
Yes. So I'll be talking about tonometry in general OPD, eye care for all. Though the GAT is considered the gold standard in IOP measurement, the new portable eye care tonometer is gaining popularity, especially in the COVID times. So this has a unique mechanism of measuring the IOP, and it has become popular worldwide due to its ease of use. The most notable advantages been the lack of air puff and need of topical anesthesia, and the ease of operation and its ability to use it with children. The rebound tonometry works on the dynamic electromechanical method for measuring the IOP. This device consists of two coils, a solenoid propelling coil and sensing coil, and the application of a transient electric current to the solenoid coil propels the probe to the cornea, and this movement induces a voltage within the system which is monitored by the sensor, allowing the speed and direction of the probe movement to be determined. As the probe impacts the cornea, it decelerates and rebounds from surface, and this deceleration is less at low compared with the high IOPs, and consequently higher the IOPs. So currently 4 rebound tonometers are available, which are iCare TAO1i, iCare Pro, iCare Home, and iCare IC100. The iCare TAO1i was commercially available since 2003, and it has a 1.8 mm plastic ball over a stainless steel wire held on place by an electromagnetic field in a handheld battery-powered unit. While doing the procedure, there's no corneal anesthesia is required, and on activation of the measurement button, it automatically takes 6 readings of IOP, disregarding the highest and lowest reading before the presenting a digital readout of the average IOP. Several studies have compared the accuracy of the IOP measurement with GAD, and Gao et al. Reported that the iCare rebound tonometer readings correlated well with those of the GAD. The next one was the iCare Pro, which was available since 2011, and it's a short probe with positioning sensor, and it allows the IOP to be measured even in supine position. iCare Pro gives a mean IOP closer to that obtained with the GAD, and the previous reports have shown that the mean IOP difference between the GAD and the iCare Pro is around 0.38 millimeter of mercury. Chen et al. Also found that there was no significant difference between the mean IOP measured with iCare Pro and GAD in the 4 IOP groups. The iCare Home is also available, and it is equipped with the eye recognition sensor and positioning sensor. And this device has been a useful tool to obtain the diurnal IOP values. Takagi et al. Found a difference in the IOP range between 0.3 and 2.5 with the self-measurement. And the updated version of the iCare TOI was the iCare IC100. It also comes with a positioning sensor and a color-coded display. The mean IOP difference between iCare IC100 and GAD was found to be around minus 2.5 millimeter of mercury, and it was also found to be significantly lower than that with the GAD. A small note on sterilization of iCare tips. Wiping the iCare probes with in between the uses with isopropanol has been reported to be safe, and microbial transmission is significantly lower than that for reusable GAD prism heads. There's a table showing the characteristics of different iCare tonometers. So hence the advantages of using the iCare rebound tonometry is that it's a portable handheld tonometer, does not require corneal anesthesia, and also its ease of use in children.
Murali, you were not audible in the last 10 seconds. Thank you. So Dr.
Okay,
Manju Pillai, over to you to summarize and discuss both the topics, especially taking into consideration the current COVID era also. Dr. Manju, are you there? Am I audible? Somebody can just raise a voice and
Yes,
tell me.
Amit, Dr. Amit, you are very much audible.
Yeah, Dr. Manju is there or no?
And Manju is not responding, I think.
Yeah, Dr. Manju is not there? Okay, so if she is not there, Dr. Jatendra Bhalla from the panelists, I request you to finish in 1 minute, and Dr. Madhu Bhaduria, you also can pass a comment for 1 minute. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Amit. I think that was wonderfully, both the speakers put forward their points of view very nicely and emphatically. But I would still, being a traditionalist, I would still go with Dr. Shweta Tripathi, because I would believe that Goldman applanation tonometer is still the gold standard, with inherent advantages of iCare tonometer, like it's portable and of ease of use, being non-contact, particularly in pediatric age group and geriatric age group. Those advantages are still there. And in COVID times, yes, we can use it. But it's still Goldman applanation tonometer remains the gold standard. And what is more important is that for screening, we can err towards using the rebound tonometry. But for treatment purposes, all these readings of rebound tonometry needs to be verified with Goldman applanation tonometry. So my go-to instrument still remains the applanation tonometry by Goldman.
Thank you, Dr. Bhalla, for your comments. Dr. Madhu Bhaduria, before you comment, I would just like to remind the title, Tonometry in General OPD, Applanation for All versus iCare for All. So basically, we are asking in terms of in general OPD, that means a screening purpose.
Amit,
Thank you, Dr. Madhu. Over to you.
I got it. I got it what you are saying. And let me tell you first and foremost, tonometry is something which has to be done for everybody who comes to the OPD. Now it comes to definitely 35 and above. There is no question of tonometry not being done. Between 15 and 40, that is the young age group people, people with a family history of glaucoma of any kind, any history of trauma, steroid use. In these people, it is definitely a must, but actually it can be done in all. And in pediatric age group, whatever are the indicators of pediatric glaucoma or a family history of glaucoma, these people must undergo a tonometry. Now, coming to tonometry, it depends from practices to practices. A general practice which is high and has not so many patients with more manpower, GAT is the perfectly right tool. There is no going, and Dr. talked about it. But when it comes to OPDs with large high volume, eye care does very well for the reasons that it is a device which is short and sweet, no anesthesia required, positioning is not required, and sterilization is easy. But who are the people out of these who are screened who need to undergo apprenticeship tonometry? People who have IOP above and below 10 and 20, people who have fluctuation in two eyes, people who are high myopes, people who are high hyperopes, these people must undergo again the tonometry by this. And all the corneal patients who have undergone refractive surgery, eye care from peripheral cornea is one of the best options available. Thank you, Amit. Anything
Thank
more?
you, Dr. Madhu. Thank you, Dr. Balla, for finishing this session on time. So we go for our next topic. We have pre-perimetric glaucoma, treat immediately versus masterly inactivity. So treat immediately is by Dr. Premanand Chandran and masterly inactivity is by Dr. Sachin Dharwarkar. The discussion for this particular topic is Dr. Shival Fatima. Over to you, Dr. Premanand.
Yeah, shall I share?
Please share your screen. You are audible. And your screen also is visible. Start the timer, please.
Yeah, I'll start with the case scenario. It's a 52-year-old female who came for routine checkup, and her best corrected visual acuity was 6/6 in both eyes, and her IOP was 16 in the right eye and 24 in the left eye. Her angles were open, and her central corneal thickness were average. So when we looked at her disc, we found that the right eye is around average size disc with a 0.6 cup to disc ratio, and the rim looks healthy with the mild darker striations, but otherwise there's no obvious ornamental loss. Whereas when we come to the left eye, it seems a little oval disc, and it's around 0.7 CDR, and the rim looks okay. But when you look carefully of the ornamental, you're able to make out a little more than a slit ornamental loss in the superior area, which is also quite obvious, visible in the red streak. So we went ahead and we did OCT for that patient, and the OCT also is suggestive of a superior ornamental thinning, which is correlating with what we suspected. And this is the GCC of the patient, in which the right eye's GCL is normal, whereas the left eye, we are able to make out the superior ornamental loss, as well as there is also ganglion cell loss in the macular region, which is correlating with what we suspected. And this is the field of the patient, which is within normal limits in the left eye. And we did the DVT for the patient, and the right eye had a maximum myopia of 18, and the left eye had a maximum myopia of 26. So we diagnosed her with the primary open angle glaucoma, and the diagnosis was a pre-perimetric. So what is pre-perimetric? So pre-perimetric is nothing but it's a glaucoma. So basically, there's a structural damage, but the damage is not being picked up by the visual field test what we have. So why there is a difference between the structural and the functional damages? So if you see this picture, so for you to have a significant visual field damage, even for about say 2 decibels in mean deviation, you need to have at least 50% loss of the ganglion cells. This is mainly because of the redundancy in the visual system. There is significant overlapping of the ganglion cell receptive fields to provide a substantial functional reserve. So now coming to the important question. So whether you treat this patient or you remain masterly inactive. So to answer this question, we need to know what will happen to the patient if you don't treat them. In the other sense, what is the natural course of the disease if you don't treat them? So this is the picture which tells you that the glaucoma starts with ganglion cell apoptosis, and it begins to the structural damage, followed by the functional damage. So we are currently in this stage where we have structural damage, but still there is no functional damage. Suppose if you don't treat this patient at this stage, you end up in having a functional damage in the future. So I would like to say there is no need to be a masterly inactive in an active disease, because the IOP is high, and if you don't treat them, you end up in having a functional damage. So I like to treat this patient, and I would like to say if the IOP is high, definitely you have to treat a patient with a preperimetric glaucoma. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Premanand. So, Dr. Sachin, over to you. Dr. Sachin is going to speak for masterly inactivity. Sachin, your slides are visible now. Sachin, you're not audible. Unmute yourself.
Am I audible now?
Now you're audible. You're
Okay.
audible. Your slides are visible.
So I'll speak in favor of masterly inactivity. So the basic tenet of clinical medicine is first do no harm. So no medicine is best medicine and least medicine is best alternative, unless we have sufficient merit to the contrary. Now to prove this, the onus is on us. About masterly inactivity does not mean that doing nothing. Read diligent follow-up. Now the fear of missing treatable disease is ingrained in us, and to counteract this attitude, we have to have an equally ingrained fear of perpetuating illness behavior, if occurs, we would order unnecessary tests and carry out poorly indicated medical procedures, read interventions. So in preperimetric glaucoma, basically it is a gray zone. It's not consistently defined in pre and post OCT era, and each research article has slightly different perception. Current perimetry definitions to find out defects rely on Anderson's criteria. They neither tell you whether it's 24-2 only or 24-2 and 10-2, as my esteemed colleague has not mentioned in the previous slide. And there are limitations to the structural assessment in the clinical as well as imaging methodologies. We do have to have more clarity about what true preperimetric disease actually is. Now, what guidelines say about glaucoma management in general? All the EGS, CGIC, WGC, if we refer to them, then the very important fact that they mention is preservation of visual function adequate to the needs. And they say that if there is a low risk of visual field loss, you should not treat. Now, the treatment affecting quality of life is very important and of practical value. So the keywords are visual function and quality of life, not RNFL or not the disc photograph. So treating of which of this will affect quality of life? A CD 0.8, a RNFL which is 75 microns, or a field which looks like this. So vision related quality of life is not impaired in patients with preperimetric glaucoma is a study which has been published and we all know it. Now, what are the diagnostic limitations in preperimetric glaucoma? Now, when we use OCT, there are differences in machines in terms of reproducibility, accuracy, and that is an important consideration. A wide range of machines are used for study. Above factors have to be considered, and normative databases are not all encompassing and we can give you substantially erratic results in some cases. The big question is repeatability. Autocentration and ability to detect progression in green is limited to very, very few instruments which may not be available to everybody. And this is a very important fact to be considered in preperimetric glaucoma. As far as therapeutic audits are concerned, if we go to our sticky wicket, that is the number needed to treat and number needed to harm, we definitely know from the experience of various clinical trials that the NNTs of conditions in which already there has been existing glaucoma has also not been quite satisfactory. It's been around 5.88, 16.7, 15 for the OATS study, which can be considered nearest to the example that Premanand gave us. So it's 15. So NNT of 15 for a case of OATS is something that we need to ponder about when we think about starting to treat preperimetric glaucoma, which according to me can be quite overzealous. So drugs do affect quality of life. There's something called as number needed to harm. So we do not have similar data for preperimetric disease. So we have to be cautious before treating each and every case of preperimetric glaucoma. When you see expert opinions, when the disease status is uncertain and the risk is uncertain, CGIC says reassess both and not treat. Preperimetric glaucoma, if you ask Dr. Anders Hale, he says that it's a difficult diagnosis and can be erroneous. The goal of treatment is to prevent loss of quality of life, and most patients with preperimetric disease never suffer any QOL, which is actually the aim of glaucoma therapy. And receiving a diagnosis of glaucoma itself reduces a patient's QOL. So all these things need to be pondered about. So if you see this patient is an 80-year-old male, systemically nil, and he has other normal parameters. If you see the OCT has gone down from 94 to 79 with field defects, absolutely not there. Would you treat? Now, if with the above background, your answer is no, I have conveyed my point. So the conclusion is treating every case of preperimetric disease is not practical and not evidence-based. Due diligence and follow-up is mandatory though. Discuss with the patient and treat only if associated with high risk factors that would cause functional loss in the lifetime. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Dr. Sachin. So, Dr. Shival, over to you for discussing the presentations of both the speakers in 3 minutes.
That was really nice, Sachin and Dr. Chandran. It's a pleasure to hear you every time. I know in your clinical practices, neither of you follow what you've said. All of you customize, because that's the only, every therapeutic decision in glaucoma is based on customization to the individual patient's needs and hopefully also their wishes. So I don't think I need to clarify those, because that Dr. Aditya walked through all of the comorbidities and the correlating factors that we must consider when we take a therapeutic decision. The only thing I would like to emphasize is that customizing your treatment plan to your patient is essential, keeping in mind both the quality of life of the patient as well as the cost of treatment for that particular patient. There'll be a subset of patients who you will not be able to follow up. In those, you will err on the side of caution, and those who you know will come back to you, you can actually take a more laid-back approach. Either ways, I'm going to say this for almost every therapeutic decision debate today. Remember to customize, remember to communicate, remember to document, and remember to document your communication. I think as we step into the area of precision medicine and step away from evidence-based, and I was so happy to see both Chandran and Sachin use unique case scenarios to elucidate their point. As we step to individualizing precision medicine for individual patients, it's important so much to document and communicate the same with our patients. I think as long as we're doing that, we are safe. There is no one size fits all. The only word I took offense to when Chandran said was definitely. There are no definites in glaucoma. And Sachin, you played it safe by saying customize, customize, customize. So well done, both of you. A privilege to have been here, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Shival. Very nicely articulated, very nicely put up. I think the message is very clear. So from the panelists, Dr. Rangaraj, I would like a short and sweet comment for all our audience so that a take-home message is given for this particular topic.
Yeah. See, actually, my comment would be, almost as the previous, panelist mentioned. Basically, if you find, if you find that there is a structural damage, then definitely go ahead and treat. This is what one of the panelists said, and the other panelists showed the scenario where everything was normal and they chose to follow up. I would suggest that when you choose a program to test your visual field, choose a modern, proper one, which also includes the central field, which in HFA, you got the, actually you have the new program. So you can go for 22-C, which also takes approximately 10 more points in the center. So look at it objectively, customize for each patient you encounter. And if your pretest probability is high, then it's likely that this patient may have a damage in future. That's how I would.
Thank you, Dr. Rangaraj. So we end this debate over here itself. We go to the next debate: medication for POAG, PGA first versus non-PGA first. So PGA first is by Dr. Paraj Dave and non-PGA first is by Dr. Jyoti Bhatt. We have Dr. Kavita S as a discussant for this, and we take the panelist comment by Dr. JC Das sir at the end of this discussion for this particular topic. So over to you, Paraj.
Okay, is everything visible?
Audible and visible.
Okay, thank you so much, AIOS Scientific Committee and Dr. Amit Pawar in particular for this opportunity. Let us get down and start. So we all know that the aim of glaucoma therapy is to maintain visual function along with quality of life. For the sake of comparison, I'll be discussing these 4 points wherein we'll compare the various medications with prostaglandins. So let us start with the dosage. We all know that prostaglandins have a very convenient once-a-day dosage, and patient is usually, once he or she puts the medication at night, they are free to do whatever they want in the morning. So it is very, very convenient. Others usually have a twice or thrice daily application, and it is very, very much possible that they'll tend to forget putting medications at least once or twice during the day. So as far as the dosage is concerned, prostaglandins definitely emerge as a clear winner. Moving on to the IOP lowering, we all know that the prostaglandins come in the stronger group. That is, they cause an IOP reduction of 25 to 35%, which is the maximum. Therefore, prostaglandins are the most potent glaucoma medication drops that we currently have. Also, as far as the IOP fluctuations, we all know that fluctuations are an independent risk factor for glaucoma progression, and it is here also that the prostaglandins are most effective in blunting the fluctuations. Therefore, as far as the IOP lowering is concerned, again, prostaglandin emerges as a clear winner. Moving on to the side effects, we all know that prostaglandins' definite contraindications include inflammatory glaucomas, macular edemas, a history of herpetic keratitis, and the various other side effects like conjunctival injection, though they are there, they may not be very significant in most patients. Eyelash growth is definitely a concern, and there is also periocular hyperpigmentation. Iris color change is not very significant for Indian eyes because the irises of the Indian people are actually very dark, so this change is not actually observed. Moving on to the alpha agonists, agonists are actually very notorious for causing allergic reactions, and they also cause fatigue and somnolence, and therefore they may not be very suitable for those people who lead a very active lifestyle. Parasympathomimetics, we all know they have a whole range of local side effects which make it very difficult for us to use them. Therefore, they have very specific indications, and apart from that, we normally don't use them very often. Moving on to the carbonic anhydrase inhibitors, they can cause metallic taste, allergies, and they are not suitable in corneal edemas and eyes with endothelial dysfunction. And therefore, there is also a risk of aplastic anemias, thrombocytopenia, sickle cell disease, although very, very rare. So moving on to the beta blockers are very notorious for causing a whole range of systemic side effects. They are not suitable for patients with COPDs, asthma, heart blocks. They cause bradycardia, hypotension, and they are also notorious for causing depression and impotence. Therefore, this has to be kept in mind, especially in young patients. Just to summarize the side effects, if you look into the local side effects, the prostaglandin, especially latanoprost, would come in the low category, whereas latanoprost and travoprost would come into the medium category. If you look into the systemic side effects, prostaglandins are definitely the safest medications that we currently have. Therefore, in terms of side effects, again, prostaglandins do emerge as a favorable option. Moving on to the cost, we are all well aware. I'm deliberately comparing the cost of the prostaglandin with timolol maleate, which is the cheapest glaucoma medication. And we all know that prostaglandins can be expensive. However, in a cost-conscious patients, if you can select appropriate brands which actually work in your hands, this cost difference can definitely be lowered. So it is definitely possible to lower this cost difference. To conclude, we all know that glaucoma causes irreversible optic nerve damage, and therefore it is imperative that we give the best and the most effective option first. And prostaglandins have a proven track record over a period of so many years now. And therefore, I wholeheartedly urge you to always start with a prostaglandin unless it is contraindicated. With this, I rest my case. Thank you so much for your patient listening.
Thank you, Dr. Paraj. Over to you, Dr. Jyoti. The screen is visible. You are muted, Jyoti. Please unmute yourself.
Jyoti, unmute.
Dr. Jyoti, unmute. Yeah.
So good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll be talking about the non-prostaglandin analogs first line treatment in the management of primary open-angle glaucoma. We know that prostaglandin analogs are associated with ocular and cosmetic side effects, which could be bothersome to some patients. And when you discuss with them, they might not choose them as the first-line management because of the same reason, and especially so in a unilateral glaucoma. Prostaglandin analogs are also known to be associated with ocular allergies, especially drugs like bimatoprost, and hence they should not be used as a first-line management, preferably in patients who are giving history of ocular allergy or ocular surface disorder. Cost will continue to be an issue in our country where drugs like timolol continue to be the cheapest and PGA is one of the costliest, as has already been highlighted with the previous speaker. And we also know that affordability goes hand in hand with compliance. So sometimes it could be the reason that cheaper alternatives like timolol could be the only affordable alternative. Targeted intraocular pressure is an important consideration while deciding the initial drug. And if initially what we want is maybe just 15 to 20 or maybe 25% reduction from the baseline, then any of one of these group of drugs can be used effectively, prudently, to decrease the intraocular pressure, starting as the first line management, instead of going for a PG analog, which can give you much more decrease in the intraocular pressure. So that will depend on the individual risk profile, what you decide. Now, if a POG patient becomes pregnant, then the only safe drug is brimonidine. All the other drugs being category C, where the adverse effects are reported in animal studies. On top of that, the PGA are oxytocic, can cause abortion and premature labor, and hence should be avoided during pregnancy, during which time brimonidine as in the first trimester. Second trimester, a beta blocker or a carbonic anhydrase inhibitor can be added. Third trimester, you can continue everything, except in the later stage where brimonidine has the potency of suppressing the central nervous system in the newborns. That should be avoided. So just in passing, I'll touch the fact that the PGA analogs have not been found to be as efficacious in pediatric age group. And so topical beta blockers and carbonic anhydrase continue to be the first and second line management here. Various case reports have shown recurrence and reactivation of herpes simplex virus disease after prostaglandin analog use, and hence POG patients with herpetic eye disease, this is a definite contraindication. PGAs are also known to mediate inflammation and causing blood-aqueous barrier breakdown, and case reports have shown an increase in the IOP and recurrence of inflammation in acute uveitis. And so, again, PG analogs in POG patients with acute uveitis is a contraindication, as also in cystoid macular edema. At least PG analog should not be given as a first-line management in patients who give history of CME in the other eye following an uneven full intraocular surgery, or this eye has undergone an even full intraocular surgery where there could be a tendency of patients suffering from cystoid macular edema. So all these case scenarios that we have discussed about here, any one of these group of drugs can be given as a first line depending on the individual risk profile. The most important cause of post-op inflammation, failure is post-operative inflammation, where we don't want to use a pro-inflammatory drug like a PG analog, where a ROCK inhibitor, because by suppressing the TGF-beta, which is a cytokine, it regulates the post-surgical wound healing, should be the first line of treatment, as also to decrease the post-op intraocular pressure immediately after trabeculectomy, because again, we don't want to use a pro-inflammatory drug like a prostaglandin here, even a aqueous suppressant like a beta blocker. Now, the POG patients are known to be steroid responders, and if they are experiencing this because of a topical or a systemic use, again, a ROCK inhibitor, which acts at the level of exactly their mechanism of action is antithesis of how steroids bring about the increase in the intraocular pressure, so that should be the first choice. ROCK inhibitors are again known to maintain consistent IOP reduction throughout 24-hour period, which is not dependent on the baseline IOP. So POG patients with lower baseline intraocular pressure, especially NTG patients, which is a variant of POG, first line drug should be a ROCK inhibitor like a natarcil. ROCK inhibitors have also been found to be endothelial friendly, helping in regeneration. Studies have shown to—
Dr. Jyoti, your time is up. Can you please conclude?
So in patients with compromised endothelium, of POG patients, ROCK inhibitor should be the first line management. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Kavita, over to you.
Yeah. I would like to thank Dr. Parag and Dr. Jyoti Madam for putting up their views in a very nice way with scientific evidence. And from the discussion, it is very clear that prostaglandin analogs are like very effective with a convenient once daily dosage, because the dosage is very important for us to maintain the patient compliance, and also we get maximum pressure reduction with a single drop, and also the control of diurnal fluctuations, which is not seen with any other group of anti-glaucoma medications. And all these things make the prostaglandin analogs definitely the first choice in patients with primary open-angle glaucoma. But the one of the drawback, as highlighted by both the speakers, it's the cost factor. To some extent, it is being taken care of by the generics. So we had a recent meta-analysis published in the Journal of Glaucoma. There is a paper, meta-analysis analyzing comparing the generics with that of the original molecules, where they have concluded that generics are safe and effective as that of the original molecules. So the cost factor is also being taken care of. Probably the next question will be the need of refrigeration. For that also we have now refrigeration-free, room temperature-based molecules are coming up, and we do have the options of preservative and preservative-free medications in patients who are not able to tolerate BAK. As rightly pointed pointed out by Jyoti Madam, there are specific conditions, probably an uveitis condition and other inflammatory glaucomas, a post-operative glaucoma, where we will not be able to use prostaglandin analogs. We have the option of choosing other non-PGA drugs. And among the prostaglandin analogs, again, I think we need a separate debate to see which prostaglandin analog to choose, and also know whether to go for a preservative or a preservative-free medications. But on the whole, definitely prostaglandin analogs are supposed to consider the first line as recommended by various guidelines from the various societies. It is considered as the first line of choice. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kavita. So the topic was primary open angle glaucoma. So from the panelists, I request Dr. J.C. Das sir to give a concluding remark for this particular topic. Sir, you have to unmute yourself, sir. You are muted.
Yeah, I'm audible.
You are audible.
So
now.
when you decide to treat a open angle glaucoma patient, there are a few considerations. So first thing is, what is your intraocular pressure level you want to bring down? What is your target pressure? If you want the target pressure should be lowered by around say 25 millimeter of mercury, then you choose a first line of drug which will reduce the intraocular pressure by 25 millimeters mercury, by 25%. And the second consideration will be availability, it is compliance and the quality of life and cost and affordability and everything. So 3 drugs are available for this person as the first line treatment. One is the prostaglandin analog, and second is beta blockers and brimonidine. Of course, the newer drugs are coming up in the market. But when you prescribe a medication, please be very, very particular about the side effects of the drug, which is very, very important. Brimonidine, because it causes notorious for its allergic reaction and its central nervous system effect, one has to be very, very careful. Beta blockers normally causes a bradycardia, which patient doesn't know, and it brings down the blood pressure. Patient is not aware of it. So and asthma is getting aggravated. Patient doesn't know about it. So we must be very careful in giving the beta blocker. The third option, which is little safer, prostaglandin analog, and various preparations and the generic preparations are available. And preservative-free, preservative are different this thing, but you can start with the prostaglandin inhibitor and the prostaglandin analog, and it's a comfortable dosing schedule, and the quality of life little becomes better. And cost-wise, maybe you are putting 2 times or 3 times drops, and this you are putting just once. So cost is not that up. There are few studies to say that the generic preparation of the prostaglandin analog is equivalent cost-wise to the other drugs. But I think if you want to choose it, unless there is a contraindication for any of these drugs, you are at liberty to choose a prostaglandin inhibitor, prostaglandin analog, because that is the first drug of choice for convenience and for controlling the blood pressure.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your concluding remarks. So we take the next topic. The next topic is PACS, laser iridotomy for all versus LPI for high-risk cases. We have Dr. Pankaj Bandale for laser iridotomy for all. Please start sharing your screen, Pankaj.
Yes,
and we have Dr. Shika Gupta for LPI for high-risk cases. The discussant is Dr. Gauri Jaydev Murthy for this. And I request Dr. Partha Mandal, the panelist, to give a concluding remark of less than 1 minute. Thank you.
My slides are visible, sir?
You are audible and visible, both, Pankaj.
Yes. Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you for inviting me for this debate. And it's a debate about PACS cases, YAG iridotomy for all. So this is the angle closure disease classification, where it evolves from the stages of primary angle closure suspect to angle closure and angle closure glaucoma. And we are discussing about the first zone, where there is oppositional contact, no pass, normal IOP, disc healthy, but trabecular meshwork is at risk, and whether to do LPR or whether to do observation. So this is what the data that is coming from the ZAP study, where it is recently published last year, which shows incidence of angle closure disease was very low among individuals classified as primary angle closure suspect identified through community-based screening. Laser iridotomy had a modest, albeit significant prophylactic effect, and widespread prophylactic peripheral iridotomy for primary angle closure suspect is not recommended. So this is what is the evidence that is coming. Not all should be treated, but I will differ on this issue. Even in India, we had one study which was 2003, where we said 1 in 5 patients progress from PACS to PSC over a period of 5 years, and 1 in 4 goes on to develop primary open angle glaucoma. Now, this was one study which showed the risk is minimal. Now, this was all studies which have a drawback. They are single center. They are mainly in the different population or unique population. Like one is Chinese, one is in US population, one is Indian population. Where in first study, they observed 485 patients for 4 years. And they said only 6 developed acute primary angle closure glaucoma. In one study in USA, where 129 patients were there, only 8 developed glaucoma, which was 6.2%, and one small study in Vellore where 48 patients were treated and 0 patient developed acute primary angle closures. So that's what they are saying. The risk of developing primary angle closure glaucoma is minimal over a period of time. But acute angle closure glaucoma is a potentially blinding emergency. Pupillary block is thought to be the major component, and we know that is not the only component. But doing iridotomy does eliminate the pupillary block, and LPI in PACS slows down the progression to PAC, and LPI is fairly benign. Now, possible negative arguments against PIRs, iritis, IOP spike, some dysphotopsia, acceleration of cataract development of posterior synechia, and LPI only treats pupillary block, which is not the all mechanisms of angle closure. So they are taken into account, but we know there is a definite reduction in the progression of disease. Now, this one article in 2007 from Dr. Pandav, which shows after LPI, rate of progression from PSC to PSCG was less than expected, and it alters the natural course of disease because the native trabecular meshwork gets saved. So we know native trabecular meshwork is at risk because of repeated iridocorneal contact, and we want to save the native trabecular meshwork so that it functions long. And LPI appears to alter the natural course across all the spectrum of angle closure disease from PSCS, PSC to PSCG. Now, there are many unknown factors about angle closure disease, like dynamic iris behavior, which is undilated and dilated, iris volume studies by anterior segment OCT, dynamic caudal thickness changes. We still don't know what are the final triggering events for acute angle closure glaucoma because these factors are still unknown. And the number needed to treat these statistics is a lot of times highlighted, but I will highlight there are a few drawbacks to these statistics. Their number needed to treat is the number of patients you need to treat to prevent one additional bad outcome. And similar one index Dr. Sachin was saying about number needed to harm. So here we have an adverse effect because of the medications. So this are not the intrinsic property of treatment, but they are property of population that receive the treatment. And different populations have different baseline risk factors. Final effectiveness in the real world property that affects our clinical decision making. So many risk hangs on the patient. Some patients get accidental exposure of anticholinergic medication systemically for some other pre-anesthetic medication, and they land up in the angle closure glaucoma. So best rationale as a doctor is to err on the caution side. Even the aspirin has a number needed to treat of 1667. So that is a very high. So it is better to overtreat in current medical legal area. Statistics don't save us there. So in my opinion, YACPI for all PACS patients till many unknown aspect becomes clear about the pathogenesis of angle closure disease. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pankaj. That was excellent. Well in time. Dr. Shika, over to you.
Yes, sir. At the outset, I would like to thank the Dr. Amit and the organizers for giving me this opportunity. So Dr. Pankaj has really summarized well.
Please share your screen. Your timer has started.
Is it not visible?
No, your screen is not visible.
8 minutes.
The timer is supposed to be for 4 minutes. Just wait. Don't start the timer. Shika, yeah.
Yeah, I cannot see my presentation in this. I'll just check again. It's not through all windows. Yeah, here it is.
So now your presentation is visible. Please start the timer and start your presentation.
So for me, I will not do LPI for all patients. We can see we are talking about treating asymptomatic eyes, which are narrow angles. So in a population, there are so many people lying there who are asymptomatic with narrow angles. Looking at the Chinese example, the population of PACS is 28 million and only 4 million are PACG. So the question to us today is, are we going to treat 28 million people with LPI? Looking at LPI, the risk of the procedure is less, the benefit is less, and also only a fraction of PACS patients will develop PAC or PACG. When we look at the ZAP trial, which is a Zhongshan angle closure prevention trial, it's the largest single-site trial in ophthalmology, where 890 patients were recruited. They were all bilateral PACS, and each eye was randomized to undergo either LPI or no LPI. In this series, in this RCT, they showed that 15 eyes of the group that received LPI developed PAS compared to 30 eyes in the other group. Only 1 eye developed acute angle closure attack in the LPI group compared to 5 eyes, of which 4 were dilated. So dilatation is a risk factor in the group which did not receive LPI. Also, when we look at number needed to treat, it is 44 eyes. When we look at prevention of PACS to PAC, which is also a low outcome measure at 6 years. And if we talk about glaucoma, it is like at 10 years, we need to treat 126 eyes to prevent any kind of sight loss. Though annual risk reduction is there, but this number we have to really look at when we are talking about Indian population, that are we going to treat all of them? The benefits are of course there with LPI. When looked at in a population with PAC, it was found that it increases the angle width significantly at 2 weeks. But however, it again decreases back to 18 months, but it is still significantly different from the eyes which are not treated. And the rate of angle narrowing is also more in eyes which are not treated. When we look at PACS group, it decreases, of course, the attack of acute angle closures and also delay PACG. However, when we are talking about conversion rate of 4% to 2% in community-based screening, this study was hospital-based screening, and of course the patients were more at a severe stage, and they showed, Indian studies showed that 22% patients of PACS may progress to PAC. But the community screenings shows 2 to 4% will progress. Also, in the eyes which have received LPI, 15% will still go into PAC or PACG. Although LPI is safe, not much side effect except for the glare, which 10% of the patients may complain of, irrespective of the size. But still, the current recommendations, also as propounded by ZAP trial, that though acute angle closure incidence is decreasing from 7.97 to 4.19, the risk is less than 1% per year of conversion. So it is only recommended against use, they recommended against use of PACS patients to save time, money, and unnecessary interventions. So for me also, we treat PACS in our center also in high-risk cases such as fellow eyes of patients after acute angle closure attacks, or the fellow eye is a chronic PACG. The patient requires frequent dilatation. For example, he has diabetic retinopathy. He has clear lens and he may not require lens extraction near future. And he has some symptoms of headache or eye pain that may suggest that, okay, he has primary angle closure. He has a family history of angle closure. And he has some onset of PAC in the sense that he has some development of PAS or intermittent high IOP or an anterior lens surface that vaults into the anterior chamber. For the rest of the patients, I'm going to counsel them that the risk is low. And if you can come for follow-up, why not? And defer the treatment of LPI in all PACS patients. So that's my take. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Shikha. Dr. Gauri, over to you for discussing both the presenters.
Yeah. Dr. Pankaj and Dr. Shikha have done a good job of discussing the merits and demerits. But what I would like to
Dr. Shikha, please stop sharing your screen.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Gauri, go ahead.
Shall I start, Dr.
Yeah,
Amit?
please go ahead, Gauri.
Yeah. So what I would like to say is, what is the first principle of medicine? It is that you should do no harm. Okay. So whatever the intervention may be, it may be a very small intervention like laser iridotomy where you think it has no harm, but then there are certain patients where definitely there is harm. I would give an example of one of my patients who was a young 30-year-old photographer. This lady came with PACS, just occludable angles, totally normal disc, normal fields. And I did PI in one eye after great persuasion at that time. And the patient developed glare and halos, which made her miserable. So do not think that PI is a very harmless procedure. So Dr. Shikha and Dr. Pankaj have summarized the evidence for and against, but then one should individualize and one should not have a cookie cutter approach. So one should remember that what we need is a patient-centered approach rather than a disease-centered approach. When we are looking at LPI in ACG or PAC or PACS, let us move from, is this particular patient eligible for a PI or not? So treat that particular patient, look at the risk in that particular patient, earn the patient's trust, and tell them about the possible side effects, though they may be small, and then decide whether you want to do a PI or not. So I would go with Dr. Shikha's presentation overall. If you would like me to tell, the evidence-based approach is that you do it in patients who are at high risk and not for all patients with PACS. So, and I would like to stress that patient-centered care is what we need to do and not just a disease-centered care. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you, Dr. Gauri. Over to you, our panelist, Dr. Partha, for a concluding remark for this particular topic.
Yes, I just want to highlight two things. Like, one is definitely the patient profile. The patients we are treating, sometimes they are lost to follow-up or something like that. So considering that point, and at the same time, the risk-benefit ratio. The risk is definitely, risk of complication is very, very low, I feel. So considering the risk, the benefit is definitely high, and also considering the patient profile. Just I want to ask Dr. Srikant that if it would be your eyes, what you would do. I can tell you, my wife is a glaucoma specialist. My wife has undergone PI in both eyes. So that much I can say.
I would like to follow up.
Yeah, even I would like to follow up, Dr. Partha. It is an individual decision, and one should discuss with the patient. One size fits all thing is not advocated. I agree with Dr. Srikant.
Thank you. We go to the next topic. First failed trap. What next? Repeat trap versus valve implant. So, Dr. Monica Gandhi, please start sharing your screen. You are going to speak in favor of repeat trap, and followed by Dr. Rupali Nerlikar. She will talk on valve implant. The discussant is Dr. Vineet Ratra for this, and the concluding comment for this will be by our panelist, Dr. Madhu Baduria.
Good afternoon. So I'm going to talk about repeat trap. So the question comes, why do we need another surgery? And before we decide a new surgery, we need to know, why did the first surgery fail? So we look at the diagnosis, we look at the disease staging, the techniques and the antifibrotics which were used, what was the skill and experience of the surgeon, how long did that trabeculectomy survive? What is the age of the patient, the comorbidities, and the availability and accessibility of caregivers? So if we look at the careful consideration of the various factors, we've talked about the patient factors, but what is very important is the patient's willingness for surgery. And then when we are planning a surgery, let's say a trab, we need to see what is the site for the repeat trab or tube, as my opponent would talk about. So we look for scarring and inflammation, encapsulation, cyst formation, vascularization, patency of the earlier sclerostomy, and the mobility of the conjunctiva. Much of our wisdom is drawn from the TVT study, and I'm sure my opponent is going to bring about and say that the failure in the trab group is much more than the tube group. But that comes with the understanding and the interpretation of the study. So the interpretation which was given does say that there is a higher success rate, but it also says that there is a similar IOP reduction and similar AGM use. It does talk about the complications in both the groups, and there is no incidence of vision loss which was different. But what we need to understand is the misinterpretation of this study. So the failure rates of trabeculectomy were higher, but they were not more than what was seen in other studies. So the tube had a better failure rate because of the selection of the patients which was there, and they had a less propensity to fail. Even the authors have commented that the TVT study does not demonstrate clear superiority of one glaucoma operation over the other, and the results need to be discussed. And what we need to understand is that the complications definitely statistically put, you would see higher numbers in the trabeculectomy, but the seriousness of the complications were more in the tube group. So you had more, 2 times more persistent corneal edema. The tube shunt, if requires to be removed in cases of tube erosion, it has to be removed. Persistent diplopia was more, CME was more, and the more frequently, though not statistically significant, reoperations. Trabeculectomy group had its own share of complications. So therefore, why retrab? So my take is because there is a greater likelihood of achieving very low IOPs without medication. If we have a younger patient and we perform a trabeculectomy, we buy some years and we keep other options like a tube in our pocket to be used later if needed. If the tube surgery fails, you're pretty much at no other option but to go in for another tube. We can titrate the trabeculectomy, and in tubes, you have to, if you're using a non-valve one, you have to wait till the valve starts functioning. And trabeculectomy becomes difficult if tube is there, so we will only have to have another tube or cycloablation. And let us not forget in our context, the cost. So we have statistical analysis of lots of things, but what matters is the patient sitting in front of us, and what matters is our skill. So the result in your hands are what would matter, and not what the others are doing. So your familiarity, and therefore we know that in our country, the familiarity with TRAB is much higher than a tube. And of course, we need to take into patients' wishes and willingness. And we must remember the follow-up visits. We live in difficult times. So your choice of tube or TRAB may ultimately come down to safety, and my choice remains retrab. So over
Thank
to
you, Dr. Monica. So Dr. Rupali, over to you. Because we are running the session late by 8 minutes, I request all of you to finish before time if possible. We'll cut the discussion by 1 minute. So the discussion will be only for 2 minutes by the discussion. So Rupali, over to you. If you can cut short or move fast, we will be very happy for that.
Yes, to stop sharing first.
Yeah. Monica, yeah. Dr. Rupali, go ahead. So request you all to move through the presentation fast, and the discussions please reduce by 1 minute your discussion.
And thank you to the scientific committee for making me a part of this debate. And a lot of my points have actually been covered by Monica, so I'm very thankful to her. It's going to save me time. I'm just making some assumptions that a lot of effort has been taken to salvage the function of the first TRAB before declaring it a failure, and that the eye has an IOP not reaching target despite medication, and that there may be progression. So she has already said, why did the first trabeculectomy fail? Now, this is not a rhetoric question. More often than not, the first trabeculectomy is placed superiorly rather than superinasal or superotemporal, and therefore the top superior 140 degrees of the conjunctiva often gets handled and is prone to scarring, and therefore is likely to be setting up for another failure. The TVT which she quoted, yes, it did. If you look at it, this is not a short-term therapy. We're looking at it as a long-term control, and the long-term results were better with the tube shunt. The incidence of post-operative complications was higher with the TRAB, though vision-threatening ones were equal. The IOP reduction at 3 months was not lower with the TRAB with MMC. It was only in the initial 6 weeks that the TRAB got a lower IOP, and the amount of adjunct medications that were needed at the end of 3 years was equal. The 5-year follow-up data also showed a higher rate of reoperation with the TRAB with mito group as compared to tube shunts. So it looks like the tube shunt is a better option. Eliminating the possibility of another TRAB, who is going to do a third TRAB after 2 failed TRABs? So any further surgery is always going to be a tube. So whether you choose to do a TRAB or a tube this time, next surgery is going to be a tube. Endothelial loss. So this is dependent on how much, how you site your tube. So if you put the tube end closer to the iris, or even the ciliary sulcus if it's possible in a pseudophakic eye, and don't leave the tube very long, then the endothelial loss can be mitigated. Tube exposure and extrusion, this happens because of the change in the surface contour and the rubbing of the lid, especially in a tight lid. And this can be reduced by passing the tube under a partial thickness scleral tunnel instead of putting a patch graft, and also by taking care to instruct the patient not to rub and using a lubricant to help reduce the friction, and then the risk would be much lower. As for not achieving low target IOPs, at the end of 3 years, they found that they were exactly the same. So I'm not sure TRAB is going to give you a better control. So in summary, in COVID times, when the follow-up required is much more for a TRAB, the tube shunts are much more friendly in terms of follow-ups. You can site them better. There is less dependency on the health of, you don't need a pliable mobile conjunctiva, and there's a lower complication rate. Of course, assuming that the person who's doing it is competent in the surgery that they're performing. And with an addition of some medication, should we not achieve the very low target IOP, seems to be a much better option as compared to a second TRAB, as far the way I see it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rupali, to finishing well on time. Dr. Vineet, over to you. 2 minutes for you.
Thanks, Amit. Thanks, AIOS. You set up a fantastic debate in all of these, and there have been some wonderful talks. Both Dr. Rupali and Monica are fantastic glaucoma specialists, and they have really done justice to what they have spoken now. Well, the TVT study does look at the Barwell versus the TRAB, and they looked at patients who have either had a failed TRAB or a previous cataract surgery. So from the IOP point of view, they found that in the first 3 months, the TRAB was lower, after which there was no significant difference. And at 5 years, both had nearly the same success rate. Even with regards to medication, they found that both at the end of 2 years follow-up were evened out in both of them. The failure rate, well, the TRAB was a little higher when they looked at IOP at around 21 millimeters. The reoperations were more in the TRAB, nearly 29% as compared to 9% in the tube. Vision loss was again the same in both, and so were complications, which was slightly more in the TRAB than in the tube. But again, that was in the first month, after which they all evened out. So is TRAB superior? Well, no. They have shown that it is not superior. We need to look at the patient profile, as both Monica and Rupali have said. I would tend to go in favor with Monica and say that, yes, I would rather do a TRAB first, but I would look at the cause of failure, look at the patient profile. Those which are at high risk, say NVG or a pseudo exfoliation, yes, I would prefer to do a tube first. But look at the cause of failure, as she has very elegantly pointed out. There has been a study by the Arvind group where they looked at the, in 2019, where they looked at these surgeries of TRABs with mitomycin, and they did have good success rate. Cost, yes, a big factor. The cost of a tube is much higher. So look at the age, look at the mobility of the conjunctiva, look at the risk factor, and if they all fall in favor, go ahead with the TRAB. Otherwise, what?
Thank you, Dr. Vinit. I'm sorry to interrupt. We are running short of time. Thank you. So we take a concluding remark by our panelist, Dr. Madhu Bhaduria.
So Vineet has really summed it up, but I would say that studies are for a certain number of years, but glaucoma patient has a life, and it's a disease we have to manage for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. We don't know how much. So if whenever it's possible, do a repeat TRAB first. Factors have been talked about, because we can do a tube on top of a TRAB, but we cannot do a TRAB on top of a tube. So tube is the thing. And to tell you very frankly, I'm doing tubes for last 16 years. And whatever you say, ultimately in 15 to 16 years, all the tubes will come with some other complications. So what studies talk, let them talk the real life experience. There are many people here who are doing tubes and tell me 10, 15 years, do tubes have a problem or not? They do have. So they are good to buy time.
Thank you, ma'am. So we go away with the next topic, the neovascular glaucoma, primary tube versus primary TRAB. Dr. Aparna is already sharing the screen. She's going to talk on primary tube, and followed by Dr. Reena Chaudhary for primary TRAB. We have discussion Dr. Shirisha Senthil for this, and the concluding remark by the panelist by Dr. Venkatesh. So over to you, Aparna. So the time is reduced by 1 minute for both the speakers. I'm sorry, because we are running late of time. Aparna, please start. Unmute yourself and start. Aparna. Is there some, I think there's some issue with Aparna's net connectivity. Yes,
is it, are the slides visible?
Your desktop is visible, yeah, and you're audible also.
Oh, I'm not able to see the slides.
It will be at the bottom. You might have opened it up. So, okay, you prepare yourself. We'll take the next talk first.
Sure.
Yeah. Please go ahead, Dr. Reena.
Dr. Reena, you're on mute.
Yeah, she'll come. Please unmute yourself, Dr. Reena.
So thank you, Dr. Amit. I'll be talking about basically primary trabeculectomy for neovascular glaucoma. I'm talking in the favor of the procedure. I have no financial interest in this talk. And neovascular glaucoma, as we all know, actually is a potential blinding disease, and it often needs a multiple-pronged approach to treating it. We have to try and work on regressing the new vessels, reduce the inflammation by using anti-VEGF injections as well as laser wherever possible, and following that, treat the intraocular pressure medically, and where required, a surgical intervention is often required. The choice of surgical intervention lies between trabeculectomy with antimetabolites or a glaucoma drainage device. Cyclophotocoagulation is mostly reserved for eyes with poor visual potential. And I'm talking about primary trabeculectomy and with mitomycin C in such eyes. I know Dr. Aparna will mention that the outcomes of trabeculectomy in neovascular glaucoma is quite poor, and the older data from the 90s and all, of course, was quite poor. But when the anti-metabolites, things start to look a little better. But thereafter, with anti-VEGFs now, followed by trabeculectomy with MMC in eyes where you do not have too much conjunctival scarring, the results are not bad. So I think that is an important message, that anti-VEGFs have changed how TRABs behave in these eyes. The success rate of TRAB depends on, of course, how well you've treated the neovascularization before intervening with surgery. Usually it takes about 1 to 2 weeks following the anti-VEGF injections and good PRP wherever indicated. You have to titrate your mitomycin C concentration and also do a wider area of application. Releasable sutures also help in close monitoring postoperatively to intervene when required to maintain good IOP control. Just to look at the data, when you compare AGV with trabeculectomy with antimetabolites in neovascular glaucoma, in this study, you can see that over a period of time, at 2 years, actually the IOP lowering control was quite comparable, and there was hardly any between the two groups. Looking at the complications between groups, they were also quite similar. If you look at this very recent study, which is basically the TVT, neovascular glaucoma TVT study, here also you can see that the success rate was quite comparable in the Barveld as well as trabeculectomy group. And also the medication use, visual acuity and interventions were also similar in both the groups. They felt that the trabeculectomy group actually showed smaller numbers of late complications compared to those who had a tube implanted in their eyes. And tube exposure was a very common late complication in the other group. So just to say that trabeculectomy also is a standard care of procedure, which we are all very familiar with. So the familiarity of the procedure with the surgeons is an added advantage. The cost is taken care of, and you always have an option of implanting tube at a secondary stage if required. So just to say that many other studies where they looked at tubes and compared it with control groups, they felt that neovascular glaucoma eyes didn't do as well as the normal eyes with secondary glaucomas with tubes. So just to conclude, the complication rate also was a little higher in neovascular glaucoma eyes when tubes are implanted in them. And I would like to conclude to say that trabeculectomy with mitomycin C still is a very viable option in these eyes, especially if you've treated them with anti-VEGF and lasers before doing the surgery, especially in eyes where there's not enough conjunctival scarring or other risk factors like aphakia and all. Tube surgery primarily can be reserved as a secondary procedure in these eyes.
Thank you, Dr. Reena. Dr. Aparna, are you ready with your presentation?
Yeah, if she stops, then I can start.
Yes, she'll just stop it now. Yeah, please, Aparna, start sharing your presentation. 3 minutes, yeah.
Yeah, visible?
Yeah,
So,
visible and audible.
Thanks to scientific committee as we try near the conclude the section. This is like whether we should consider tubes for NVG eyes. So we have a lot of implants for neovascular glaucoma eyes. So what's the problem? What are the challenges that still remain in NVG? We know that the IOP course can be quite unpredictable in these eyes. They have concurrent ischemia and inflammation, which provides an engineering platform. And we have comorbidities like diabetic retinopathy, which can impact the overall success rates and also cause high risk of failure, causing loss of vision. The TVT study, like Dr. Reena said, they reported similar outcomes. The original TVT study, though, reported better outcomes of success rates of tubes and similar visual IOP control or similar reoperation rates. We have to remember that these results are not always applicable to every patient in a clinical setting, because in the original TVT study, the refractory glaucoma like NVG eyes were excluded. It was only the recent past that they concluded similar IOP outcomes in NVG eyes. Also, there's no standard definition of complications that you would find in a tube versus a trap. And if we consider dynamic factors like difference in the surgery techniques, different surgeon experience, different type of implants, bar valve versus Raman glaucoma valve, and also the patient profile, all these dynamic factors have to be considered before basing your decisions of tube or a trap in NVG. So if a simple decision parametrics has to be done, comparing these three procedures for NVG, eye production can be achieved in all the three up to 3 to 5 years. Additional procedures may be more for non-valve implants. The cost may be slightly more for Raman glaucoma valve, and there would be need for medications if you use implants versus a trap. This study compared actually the outcomes of Raman glaucoma valve in neovascular glaucoma versus control eyes, which means other refractory glaucoma eyes. This is more fair of an appropriate comparison rather than comparing tube versus trab, because there's always a potential bias while choosing what we do in these eyes. This eye, though they reported similar IP outcomes, does show a poor success rate, at NVG being a sole independent risk factor for failure. So if I say tube has its own disadvantages, it has have its own benefits. As also approach is necessary, you may consider tubes in cases of failed trab, active disease, primary or secondary procedures, or in scarred conjunctiva. So if in a severe disease like NVG, an implant can control the IOP and salvage useful vision, prevent vision loss, I would still go for tubes.
Thank you, Dr. Aparna. Dr. Sirisha.
Yeah, thank you. Both of them, I think, very well summarized. And I would go more in favor of what Aparna said. I think we need to individualize. I think this is what everybody in the debate was trying to bring to notice. So I just like to bring in one point. In the presence of persistent new vessels, where we are not able to treat the underlying cause properly, in the presence of persistent inflammation, and if the underlying etiology of NVG is a progressive disease, one may consider doing a tube, because you know that these eyes are more prone for failure in the future. But if otherwise everything else is controlled well, trabs do well, and over a period of time, both of them did not bring out comparison of trab versus tube in NVG. Over 2 years, the success rates are almost similar. So if the underlying ischemia is taken care of and it's addressed adequately, both of them do well. But I think the choice is dependent upon the persistent inflammation and the underlying etiology. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sirisha. This particular topic from Dr. Venkatesh for all the delegates.
That we are running out of time. No, I totally.
So we have 1 minute from you, sir.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Sirisha was saying. I think it's more individualized, some of these patients, and we have to understand that they are also sick. Anybody with NVG has got a diabetic retinopathy and other problems of diabetes or some other problem, hypertensive complications. So we don't want to kind of regularly bring them back for follow-up and make sure everything works in their eye. So we need to individualize, and depending on the skill and the surgeon's capability of dealing with that, no, I would say that both are good, but definitely we now at this point of time, after seeing our RD results on neovascular glaucoma, we prefer to do a tube over trab in some of these neovascular glaucoma patients.
Thank you, sir. So we try to finish on time. We are just 1 minute late. So thank you all the esteemed speakers, panelists, discussants. Thank you for making this show a great success. I was running fast. I'm very thankful to our large 4 speakers and the discussants for cutting short their time. I was not much worried because the next session is by Dr. Shweta herself. So I was like, if I even overshoot by 1 or 2 minutes, Dr. Shweta will understand the stress behind conducting a session. So thank you all the panelists. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amit. It was a wonderful session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.